Welcome to episode 134 of the Brainy Business, Understanding the Psychology of Why People Buy. In today's episode, I'm excited to introduce you to Richard Chataway, author of The Behavior Business. Ready? Let's get started.
You are listening to the Brainy Business Podcast, where we dig into the psychology of why people buy and help you incorporate behavioral economics into your business, making it more brain-friendly. Now here's your host, Melina Palmer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melina Palmer, and I want to welcome you to the Brainy Business Podcast. Today, I'm so excited to introduce you to Richard Chataway. Richard is such an awesome and fun guy to chat with. He's worked on so many amazing projects, and let me just tell you right now, you're going to love this episode. While Richard works with all sorts of businesses and organizations when applying behavioral economics as CEO of BVA Nudge Unit UK, our conversation ended up talking a lot about addiction and how he worked on some campaigns that helped people quit smoking. When you think about changing behavior and how you can apply the insights from behavioral science, it may feel like an addiction would be untouchable, like it's out of the realm of possibility. But as you'll hear today, the same concepts that are applied in businesses to help people choose the best product for them can also be used to understand behavior and help people make healthier choices, things they may desperately want to do and have struggled with for years on their own, but with a well-structured program, including the right insights from behavioral economics, it becomes possible. You can learn more from Richard and projects he's worked on in his book and accompanying podcast, both called The Behavior Business. Do note that because he's in the UK, that is behavior with a U. There are, of course, links in the show notes to make it easy for you, and you'll also find links to tons of great past episodes we'll touch on in today's conversation, including those on habits, dose brain chemicals, mirror neurons, the power of novelty and story, how to finally change your behavior, and many more. Those show notes can be found within the app you're listening to or at thebrainybusiness.com/134. Those already on the Brainy Business list got a direct link from me in the email you receive every Friday. Not on the list yet? Simply sign up for any freebie at thebrainybusiness.com and you'll be automatically added. And for those of you in the States, you can sign up easily by texting the word Brainy, BRAINY, to 33777. You'll be added to the list and get access to a super secret subscribers page with more than 50 freebies as a thank you. I'm not going to make you wait any longer because I'm just so excited to get to this interview. So without further ado, Richard Chataway, welcome to the Brainy Business Podcast.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Well, I'm so excited. We connected a couple months ago now, or maybe only a month. Who knows? Like we were saying, it's been a busy, crazy time. Your book came out somewhat recently, and for being the Brainy Business, and then there's a book called The Behavior Business, seems there's so much connection.
It's fate. Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about, let's start with you, who you are, how you got into behavioral science, and we'll definitely talk about the book as well, because it's a wonderful book and people should know about it.
Thank you very much. It's very kind. As I say, it's lovely to be here, and I'm very glad that we connected. I guess my sort of path into behavioural science, this is something I actually talk about in the book, sort of started about 15 years ago when I was working in the government here in the UK at the Department of Health, actually in a division that's now what's called Public Health England, and actually very recently as a result of COVID has been disbanded and changed into something else again. But the Department of Health, what I was doing there was I was working on anti-smoking campaigns work. So developing the kind of scary ads that that have been seen all throughout the world of telling people about the dangers and the risks of smoking and with horrific images of diseased lungs and all that kind of stuff. My background had been in media and advertising up till that point, and I joined the government in order to try and do a bit of good and to change lives and started working on those campaigns. And what was really interesting to me was that smoking as a behaviour is very interesting because it's really the kind of quintessential irrational behaviour. We're at a point now in terms of smoking, and this was true 15 years ago as well, where everyone knows it's bad for them. Everyone knows that it has long-term consequences for their health and short-term consequences. And yet lots of people still persist in smoking. It's a behaviour that's still too common, one could argue. And that was really interesting to me from a behavioural viewpoint was, despite all this campaign work that we've done, that we've been very successful in making people understand the risks, that the battle had kind of been won about those risks, that people still persisted in smoking. And what happened was we started using insights from particularly social psychology to inform the work that we were doing on the campaign. And in particular, some of these understandings of behavioural models and what drives behaviour, and particularly habitual behaviour. And smoking is a very habitual behaviour, as anyone who's ever smoked will know. And that was really, A, that I found that really fascinating and interesting. And B, what was really, it really transformed the way that we approached the campaigns and the work that we were doing. And very much at a fundamental level, it changed the approach from being about telling smokers why smoking is bad and why they need to change their behaviour to helping them quit, to providing them with tools and support to enable them to quit more successfully. Because the reason why most smokers can't quit, despite the fact that at any point 80 to 90% of them have the intention to quit and want to quit, the reason they fail is because quitting is hard and because they don't have sufficient support, or they're not using the right support to help them do that. And that was what the focus of our campaign changed. And that ended up being very, very successful. And in fact, our campaign achieved the government's targets that had been set a year early as a result of the change in focus. And so for me, it kind of, lit the fire, if you like, around behavioural science and the relevance of that in terms of, A, recognising that our behaviour is not as rational as we think it is, and that actually by recognising some of those irrationalities, we can be very successful in changing behaviour. And the other was that it was very effective. That proved to be much more effective than the kind of traditional approach of just telling people why smoking is bad. So for me, I wanted to learn more about that, and I ended up working for a government department, or a division called the COI, Central Office of Information, which was where there was a lot of best practice around communications and marketing being employed, and where we had a behaviour change unit as part of that, which was using the latest evidence around behavioural science. This was sort of in 2010. So it was after Nudge had come out, and there was a lot of, interest in behavioural science within government. And I developed a training program with a colleague around that, using best practice in behavioural science for communications. And it kind of went from there, really. So I went to work for Australian government. So I lived in Australia for a few years, where I headed up strategy for the federal government, so on communications. So everything that the government was addressing in terms of behaviour change in Australia. So that included public health issues like smoking, but also obesity. We also did work on climate change, on taxation, any number of issues that governments need to address, and there are a lot. I was able to bring that knowledge around behavioural science into that work that we were doing. And then when I returned from Australia in 2012, I ended up, I worked heading up a behavioural practice called Ogilvy Change, which is part of Ogilvy, a Mather, big global communications advertising agency. Before I set up my own business, communication science group, using the insights from behavioural science to optimise communications. And now I work for a company called BVA. BVA Nudge Unit is our team, and we are a specialist behavioural practice within BVA, which is a global market research company.
You've had a busy 10 years.
Yeah, it's been very varied, and which is what I like about the work. I think this is the thing, and one of the reasons that I wrote my book and what motivated me to write it was recognizing that actually, when it comes to the business context, there are all sorts of ways in which behavioral science can lead to better outcomes for businesses. And I guess, that was inspired by the fact that having worked in the public sector and then the private sector, that, in the public sector, we were addressing this, wide range of challenges, everything from smoking, obesity, getting people to join the armed forces, getting people to return their tax returns on time, really varied behaviours which have different, drivers and barriers to them. To then working in the business context and recognizing that actually behavioral science is as applicable to challenges in terms of recruitment, in terms of marketing, in terms of customer insight, in terms of building digital products and services, and recognizing that there is that it can be applied across a huge range of challenges in a huge range of contexts. And that's what I sort of I was never going to be able to write a book about every challenge that a business can face, but I wanted to give examples and practical advice on how behavioral science can be applied in all of those different contexts with all of those, the biggest challenges that businesses face today.
Yeah. So do you feel like in the public sector, it's really an interesting spot to where, and I feel like a lot of, the field, behavioral science, behavioral economics started because, Nudge, Thaler and Sunstein are very focused on public policies and things like that. You're making change that everyone agrees should be done in general, right? And not 100%, but like you say, for smoking, most people don't want to continue to smoke forever. There's a small percentage, but in general, that's something people want to change. So when you're wanting to help people everyone would say they want to be healthier, they want to exercise more, they want to floss twice a day, like all these things that they want to be able to save money, where coming from a financial institution side, which is a little bit different, but then, it's the time discounting gets us stuck, and it feels like this big insurmountable thing, I think, for a lot of people, where I thought it was particularly telling when you were talking about the smoking stuff, that most governments or, who would be setting those sorts of policies, having the plan, it feels like the goals get set of like, it'd be great if we did anything, but we're probably never going to move this needle. Like, it would be really nice if this, and we'll just go ahead and put a goal out there, but no one's losing their job because you didn't hit the goal, because it feels like you're never going to actually get people to stop littering, to actually recycle, to stop smoking, it just feels like it can't be done. And that's been the mindset for such a long time. And I really love that behavioral science is helping to show that, if you just talk about it a little bit differently, it can be done. Finding that right intervention. And, I've had Michael Manikay, the CEO of the Littery, on the show, and we're talking about how by turning litter into lottery tickets, everyone magically can throw away stuff and properly sort it without any help. They can do it. They know what they need to do. You just need that little bit of motivation. And like you're talking about with the smoking piece, if you talk about it in a different way, align with the brain a little bit differently, you can actually make change for people that they will appreciate, that they've been wanting to do for years or decades in a lot of cases.
Absolutely. I mean, the way I talk about it in simple terms is that how you say something is as important as what you're saying.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, we didn't change the core message, which is that smoking is bad for you, and if you want to lead a long and healthy life, then you should quit smoking. But what we did was we framed it in a different way, and framed it in a way that was more motivating, that was resonated more with people's mindset and beliefs and desires, and that's what was effective. I mean, to give you an example, one of the things that we found was that I sat in a lot of, and this goes to one of the things that I talk about in my book, is about what it means for how we research and how we gain insights into behavior, this understanding of behavioral science and these more non-conscious drivers of behavior that we have. And one of the things, I sat in a lot of kind of focus groups with smokers when I was working for the Department of Health, where all these people would be sat around the room, smokers, men and women who would, some of them be smoking for many years, others might be younger, and they would say, oh, well, I smoke because I want to. I'm just losing a few bad years at the end of my life. I'll quit when the time is right, those kind of things. And what's interesting is that, these are basically post-rationalizations. They're trying to post-rationalize the fact that they're smoking when actually you could tell in a lot of cases, a lot of them, and often they would say this simultaneously, or even a few minutes afterwards, they say, oh yeah, I actually do want to quit. And once you dive down into those motivations, and I think, there's a couple of things that are really interesting around that. One is that, how you conduct research and how you get to those kind of non-conscious motivations and what it means for research techniques generally. But also, to my mind, I guess to your point, in terms of how it influenced how we talk to smokers, what we found was there was a particular group of smokers who were a kind of core audience for us. and they were what we called routine and manual smokers. And that meant that actually they had jobs and occupations which were classified as routine or manual, which meant these were people who were working in factories, in warehouses, in stores, where they were, the very regimented jobs where there are strictly defined breaks where people could have a smoke. And the thing is that just reinforces the habit of smoking and makes it much more difficult to quit. And so, those became a core target audience for us. And what we found amongst those smokers was that actually family-based motivations were very important to them. Their families were very important. A lot of them were working, 2 or 3 jobs to support a family, for example. And they led very busy and stressful lives, both because of the nature of their work and the nature of their home life. And that reinforced the habit as well. Smoking was kind of seen as a reward for completing a shift at work or completing, having got the kids to bed, whatever it might be. That was then a cigarette was, in many cases, was the only time they had to themselves during the day. So there was a very clear kind of reward mechanism going on with that. And that was really interesting because what it meant was we could reframe the communications around the impact that smoking has on your family, because their families were very important motivations to them. So there's a whole load of evidence around the impact smoking has on your family in terms of, if you smoke, your children are 4 times more likely to smoke. Obviously, there's the impact of what used to be known as passive smoking, secondhand smoking, and so on. And that's what the focus of the campaign became about. And the really important part of that is that's not something you can post-rationalize. If you're a smoker, you can say, oh, I'm just smoking and it's only damaging myself. It's not damaging anyone else. But if you're saying to people, and we had a lot of very emotive ads, for example, which showed, it's really brutal, but kids growing up without parents because they died early because of a result of smoking, for example. And that was incredibly powerful, as you can imagine, for that particular audience. Those aren't things you can post-rationalize. You can't say, oh, by my smoking, I'm only harming myself. You are directly harming your family as well. And that proved to be very effective. And I think, so to your point, the fundamental message hasn't changed. It's that smoking is bad. It leads to all these kind of smoking related illnesses and shortens your lifespan. But, by reframing it as, and the impact of that is not just on you, it's on your family. We were able to make the campaign much more effective.
Yeah, I was making notes while you were going. And so I first want to touch on the piece you were talking about with the routine and the habit that comes, right? So where you get the break and then you feel like it's time that you need your cigarette. And I remember in talking with Nir Eyal when he was on the show, and we were talking about, and there's a really telling story in his book, Indistractable, that I think the entire book is amazing. So there's that. But he has this story about flight attendants and their need to smoke. And that if you were on a 3-hour flight, then you felt like at that 2.5 hour mark is when the craving would hit, that it's time that you're going to need to smoke when you land. When they were on a 9-hour flight, you didn't get the craving until, 8.5 hours into the flight. And so when you know that you can't, your brain doesn't want it in the same way. And when you have the cue of we're going to be landing, whatever the things you're doing in your routine to get ready to land is helping your brain to know that the cigarette is close, that you can get there soon. And like you said, that repetitive working where, at 10:15 I have a break, at noon I have lunch, at this time I do this. And if you're having a cigarette at each of those times, your brain doesn't forget when it's getting its chemicals, right? It knows what it wants. But if you can somehow shake that up and change that routine even a little bit, it can have a huge impact.
Absolutely. I mean, we know that habits are very powerful drivers of behavior, that they are effectively a manifestation of our system 1 processes. So like you say, those habits are very difficult to form, but they're also very difficult to break. And smoking is a particularly extreme example because you've also got the chemical addictive part of it, the fact that nicotine is chemically addictive as well. So those kind of habits are very powerful and influential, and and obviously we can use those for good as well. I don't know about you, but I try and leverage. Again, very influenced by Nir Eyal's work actually, because I agree with you. I think he's brilliant. I try and leverage that in my own life in terms of trying to build positive habits around my working routines and things like that, to reinforce that. But yeah, you're right. The hungriest we are is immediately before dinner time. That's
right.
because we're anticipating that reward. And that was what was really interesting and insightful for us around smoking, for this audience in particular, was it's very easy to think of smoking as being a habitual thing, that's something that people do almost, it's the ultimate automatic behavior in terms of they're not doing it consciously. And that is, largely true. But there is a reward element to it, much as it's satisfying a craving. So there is a reward to that. And also, as I say, that was particularly extreme for this audience because, to be honest, they didn't get 5 minutes to themselves during the day otherwise. So smoking has had that association of being a reward for, achieving a task or just simply having some me time, I guess.
Right. Well, and then when you're talking about the really relating on that family piece and having a strong story, I still remember, and there are the commercials from your childhood that are ingrained in there, right, in our memories. And I remember one that was one of the anti-smoking campaigns, but it was you're in the eyes of the person, so you can see him like as it's like walking around the kitchen, and like you're from his perspective, and he goes to grab the pack of cigarettes, and he goes to like open. I think he does open it, or when he turns it and he sees there's a picture, like he put a picture of his kids in between the plastic and the carton, so it's like stuck to the container, and that he ends up like putting it down and like watches them play or whatever. But you can see the moment of hesitation and he like putting it back, and it was or like it had a message from them, that sort of a thing, like "We love you, Dad" sort of a thing on the carton, the pack. Obviously, I don't smoke. I have no idea of the terminology. He's got a giant carton that he's working from, but no. So, but I remember that from when I was, 7 or something when that came out, but it resonated in a way that you've got whether it's a mirror neuron thing, whether it's just the right power of story, it impacted in a way that it spoke to me. And so I'm guessing it resonated with other people too.
Yes, absolutely. And we know obviously that emotions are very powerful drivers of our behavior. And I guess that's what we were trying to do, was to find those right emotional triggers to generate that response. And here I've got a picture of, I was very kindly given by one of the agencies we worked with, a framed picture of one of the ads that we created, we had a campaign which was about, how kids do drawings, like the kind of stick men drawings and things like that, and of houses. And we had a series of print advertisements that had kids' drawings, but in the kids' drawing, they'd drawn their parents smoking and stuff. And then the idea behind that was obviously to say that, this is the impact that you're having on your kids by. Oof. And they had one which was a kind of a Play-Doh picture that a kid had put together. And I've got it here actually. And and they modified it so it looked a bit like me. So they like put a beard on it and stuff like that. Which is kind of a gift when I left that job. So I have that on the wall here. But it was a very effective execution, a nice way to bring that concept to life.
I bet that's when the person draws the picture and, mom is yelling or standing on the phone looking the other way while the family's over there.
Yeah. We had actually, this is a sort of story associated with one of the ads was that we had a TV ad, which is on YouTube actually. I can share it with you, where it was basically lots of kind of scenes of kids and children playing and the kids and their parents playing. And we actually used real kids and parents in the ad. And they were doing kind of cute things, like one of them was making a cake alongside her mum, and another one is pretending it's a sword fight or something, and his dad's doing the same, and lots of cute things like that. And then the last scene is mother and daughter, and is standing at the doorway smoking, and the kid is behind with a crayon pretending to smoke as well.
Oof.
And that was the plan. But for the ad, we used the music we used on it. What we wanted to use was "Want to Be Like You" from the Jungle Book. The song, which was kind of the theme of the ad, and it worked very well. But we had a real problem with getting the permission from Disney to use the music. It was throughout the whole development, that was the plan, was to use that tune because it fitted the visuals perfectly. And Disney just said, no, we don't release any music for ads. And I believe they still don't. They have a policy other than their own advertisements of not using music for any ads. And in the end, I had to get the then Secretary of State for Health. I had to ask him to write a letter directly to the Walt Disney Corporation saying, we would really like to use this music in this ad. This is how many people smoking kills every year. This is the aim behind it. And it worked. And we got the permission for it. And I don't know if that's the only case that Disney have ever released for an ad not for a Disney ad. But yeah, we managed to get that. And it was Alan Johnson was the Secretary of State. Any of your UK listeners will be familiar with at that point. And I can confirm that he, what's the word? Did us a massive favour by writing that. Was very nice about it as well.
Well, that's awesome. Well, and it's one of those, and I would be interested for everyone who's listening, for any of these stories when they're coming up, I know that it's a good campaign pitch when you get the goosebumps when you hear about it and you get that kind of idea of, I sort of know what's coming. I was expecting, actually, when you were talking about it, it was going to be that the person, like the kid, is sword fighting by themselves or making the cake without.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Right. That's where I figured it would be like or they're sad or whatever, and mom's not there anymore, sort of a thing. But the copying, the smoking, I can see where that is, and my definite like arm chills of, oh no, like that. And that seems like, the last thing that any of them would want, right, as the parent.
Everyone wants to be a good parent, right? That you don't want to be role modeling negative behaviors to your kids.
Yeah. Well, I know you've worked on so many other amazing campaigns and things. And especially, so last time we talked, where you and I were chatting, we talked about completely different stories and studies, which I love. But I would just like to go with, as you were working on your book, I know, interviewed and talked to a ton of people.
I did, yes, yeah.
As tends to happen. Do you have any favorite stories from the book or things that you don't get to talk about all that often, like the little nugget that was one of your favorite parts that people don't ask about?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I guess, there are things so I guess, I should emphasize that we've talked a lot about smoking, which I think was for me, like I say, was that kind of aha moment about how behavioral science can help us with addressing all kinds of problems. The book is The Behavior Business, is about applying behavioral science in business. So the focus of the book is about how you can use behavioral science to deliver better outcomes for your business, whether it's big or small. And the opening line of the book is, if you are in business, you're in the business of behavior. And what I mean by that is that, any business's challenges typically are around behavior, that they are, whether it's a case of you want to increase your sales, that's a behavior that you're trying to influence. Ultimately, if you don't get more people to buy whatever the products and service you sell is, then you're not successful in achieving that aim. So that's a behavioral challenge. If you want people to produce those products and services, or to program the machines that produce those products and services for you, those are behaviors. And so you have to have an understanding of behavior. And what behavioral science has given us is, as you've been demonstrating through your podcast, through many brilliant episodes of your podcast, that the way we think about behavior and the way we understand behavior has changed a lot in the last 20, 30 years, or it should have changed a lot as a result of all this wonderful new evidence base that we have from behavioral science. And so, I say, we've learned more about human behavior in the last 50 years than we have in the previous 5,000. And that's, any business that isn't using that knowledge is going to be missing out. So I guess in terms of the stories that kind of, I went out and interviewed 25 experts from various different fields for the book, and they, the stories that really resonated with me and the stories that I wanted to include were of those incidents where, that behavioral science understanding and knowledge has unlocked a new way of thinking about a problem, or a new way of addressing a problem and solving a problem in business. And really, lots of people saying behavioral science has given us a new arsenal, if you want, of ways to address these problems and attack them. So, some of the things that came out in the research for the book and the interviews I did was about, one of the examples I use that resonates with a lot of people, I think, is about Google and about how the Google user interface has been informed by behavioral insights. And in particular, the thing that really struck me was, it had struck me before, but it was only by speaking to people who'd worked at Google that I got an insight into this, was how similar the Google user interface is now from when it launched in 1998. So, I remember Google launching in 1998, and it wasn't the first search engine. You already had Alta Vista, Yahoo. You remember Ask Jeeves?
Ask Jeeves. That was my jam. I was always asking Jeeves.
And you had to ask him, right? You actually had to frame it as a question. You couldn't just go, capital of Albania. You had to say, what is the capital of Albania? Question mark.
I know. He was very particular and finicky, that Jeeves.
Well, I guess that's what butlers are like, isn't it?
Right.
So, and that's, we know from behavioral science that, the more friction you put into a process like that, the less likely people are to use it, the less user-friendly it is, the less cognitively easy it is to use. And so that was the big difference with Google, was that, you had one search bar and you had two buttons. Whereas the likes of Alta Vista, Yahoo, they had AOL Online, they had multiple buttons you had to press to, you had to search by category in a lot of context. So you would have to say capital Albania, then hit the geography button to get the answer to that question. And Google just streamlined all of that. And I think what was interesting to me was that I found that a couple of things about that. One was that the rationale for that was that because they had, or Larry Page in particular, had done a PhD in information retrieval. So he had a good scientific knowledge of how people like to consume information. So he had an understanding of the behaviors around information. What he didn't have was technical knowledge. So he didn't know how to code in HTML. So when he created the first version of the page, he couldn't have all those buttons everywhere because he just didn't know how to do it. So it was purely by accident, really, that the first iteration of Google was so simple and streamlined. But what they quickly found was that people loved that. That was what people really appreciated about the interface, was that you just typed in your search query, hit one of the two buttons, and then found what you needed. And the other interesting thing about that was that they still have the two buttons on the interface, which is Google Search and I'm Feeling Lucky. Now, I don't know, have you ever used I'm Feeling Lucky? Is that...
I did after we had our conversation about this, just to kind of
right.
see what would happen. But I'm Feeling Lucky, to me, and I'm sure I had done it when I was a kid, earlier when they came out with, the original Google of 1998, that you kind of go, what does that mean? And not really understanding what it is. But even still, I worry that I'm going to get some totally random nothingness with I'm Feeling Lucky. I don't know what you're going to send me, which I guess is kind of the point.
Yeah, well, it's uncertainty. And we know that, people don't like uncertainty. It has a big influence on our behavior. So yeah, absolutely. And that was what's interesting is that they found that as well, is that they found that the button is still there when, as you say, people, we don't use it because we don't like uncertainty. The evidence I could find was that between 0 and 1% of all Google users actually use I'm Feeling Lucky. And the other thing about it is it actually costs Google money every time people do, because their revenue model is about showing you listings results that have been paid for by advertisers. And if you hit I'm Feeling Lucky, you go straight through to the top search result. So you don't see any of the paid listings. So Google make no money from you as a user when you use it. But it's still there on the site, 22 years after they launched. And the reason for that is because they've tested it with a subset of users, removing that button. And what they found is that people didn't like the search results as much. It gave them less self-efficacy in terms of the results. They had less confidence in the results that Google delivered, because what I'm Feeling Lucky implies is basically saying, it's a placebo choice, if you want, that it's saying, look, we know that you're probably going to click on the top search result because that will be the best one. So here's the option for that. But just in case you want to check your results, here's the Google search button. And the majority of people do that. And I think, that's, for me, that was really interesting as an example in a case study, because it showed, one is as how behavioral insights have informed the user interface of Google, which is one of the biggest companies in the world now, obviously, but also that the way they leveraged that, and the way they used it was to test it and to understand the importance of testing. And obviously Google has some natural advantages. It's got billions of data points on actual behavior. So for them is really easy, but it's baked into the way that they work. And in fact, the way that most Silicon Valley companies work is this approach to testing and learning. And that's what I wanted to sort of communicate with my book as well, is that understanding behavioral science is one thing, but then when it comes to actually applying it, you have to really become comfortable with testing everything and being very scientific in that way, and being experimental. And this is what I call test tube behaviors in the book, is really those two things. Is test tube behaviors are, one, understanding the realities of human behavior and behavioral science and what that tells us. And then the other is applying it in a very experimental way, continuously testing and learning to build those insights.
Right. A man and a book after my own heart, to be sure.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, I'm all about testing and doing the small tests. In doing research for my book, of which, thank you. Of course, that's how we connected, because I was interviewing you about some of the work you had done. And in that process, as you really dig in and see what other people are doing, I find it to be fascinating that even at the large scale that like Netflix does their applied, really they're just doing A/B tests, a whole lot of them, but like that's just a series of A/B tests for the majority of what it is that their behavioral science group is testing. And so you can do that, right? In business, if you want to do something, try anything, right? And just make sure that you know in advance what question you're asking, make sure you're solving the right problem, and then try some things and see what works. Do you have any examples of, I found from a lot of the people I've talked to, that often there is you tried the crazy thing that seemed like it wouldn't work, but you just threw it in and it ended up being like better than everything else that you thought should work. Did you come across any of those type of examples?
You mean sort of testing crazy things and finding that they had a
really good impact? Yeah, that they worked better than everything else, or just better than you thought they would?
Yeah, well, I guess there's one thing I'm always wary of is that finding kind of silver bullets is quite rare in terms of applying behavioral science-based interventions, in that it's often a combination of things that obviously have the impact that we want. And that's why testing is so important, because if you test 10 things and you find 4 that work really well, 3 that work maybe not so well and 3 that don't work at all, or maybe even there's a backfire effect and they're worse than what you're currently doing, then all of those insights are useful, because that there are 3 things you should never do, and there are 3 things that maybe you could do further down the line, or it's the next stage, but there are 4 things that work. And then what's interesting is then finding how they work in combination, and whether there's any whether they contradict each other, or and so on. So I guess what I'm saying is these are often messy problems that we're trying to solve. But the one thing that I found one of the slightly counterintuitive, I guess would be the best way to describe it, solution that I found was when we were working with a bank here in the UK. They were trying to improve the quality of customer experience through their telephone, so people calling up with queries related to their accounts. There were several issues that we were trying to resolve, but one of them was that the security process, the security verification process, was quite difficult. It was taking quite a long time for people to get through the security process, and often they weren't getting through it successfully. So, you can imagine the situation as a customer. You've called up, you want to transfer some money, for example. You fail your security process. They can't help you on the phone, and you have to go away and get a new password or something that might arrive in the post 5 days later. That's a very bad outcome for everyone, really. You've not achieved what you want as a customer. And also, you're likely to have got quite angry and frustrated with the process, and it wasn't ideal. Also, if people fail the security process, it extends the length of the call. And the longer a call, the more it costs the bank to manage, the fewer customers they can handle at any one time. So we were trying to resolve that security process to help people get through the process more quickly, more successfully, and deliver a better customer experience, whilst also, obviously, we wanted to make sure that it was still secure. So one of the things we found was that actually people were failing the security process because the way it was framed was quite what's the word? Not aggressive, but it wasn't putting people in the right frame of mind, basically. It wasn't calming them down. And you can imagine, when you called up the bank, you might be having quite a stressful, busy day anyway, and you want to transfer some money, whatever it might be. The last thing you want is someone on the other end of the phone going, if you fail the security process, we can't help you.
Right.
And we're going to have to take you through another process, or you're not going to get your money. You might be in the process of buying a house, for example, which is a stressful process anyway, and you can't transfer that money to do that. It wasn't putting people in the right frame of mind. They were saying, if you fail this, I can't help you. So what we did was we reframed those scripts and reframed what the people on the phone were saying to say, effectively, if you don't get through this process, don't worry, we've got another process we can take you through to verify you are who you say you are. And what we found was that instantly put people more at ease, made them less stressed, put them in less of what Dan Ariely calls an emotional hot state. And the benefit of that is that what we know is that if you're in an emotionally hot state, which is stressed or stimulated in some way, then you find it harder to remember information. It impacts mental availability. And therefore, people were more likely to fail the security process because they couldn't remember their password and key information. And so, by making people calmer, and weirdly, the most counterintuitive solution to this was we actually said to them to say to people on the phone, take your time. And bearing in mind, one of the key objectives was we wanted to make these calls shorter. Saying to people, take your time is a completely counterintuitive solution, but it works because it just puts people more at ease when they were more likely to get it right first time and made the call shorter. So I think, that's an example of one of the ways in which, behavioral science leads us to solutions that can maybe be a bit counterintuitive, maybe a bit out of left field, whatever you want to call it, but actually have a real impact and are very effective.
Right. Well, and I know I'm so glad when you started to tell the story, it's like, oh, yay, I love this example. And it is one that is, at least for now, because right now my book is in draft editing world, but it's in there if it, like I want to include it in.
If I make the cut.
It's not because of anything I did, not to blame anyone else.
No, I understand. And that was, I'll be honest, that was the hardest part of writing my book, was because they had so many good stories.
So many. Oh.
Yeah. And I felt really bad because there were some people where, they had a great story or a great case study, and it was in a footnote, or it got cut, or, we had a great long conversation and I can only get 2 lines of it into the book. And yeah, that was really hard.
That was definitely the
I feel your pain.
Excruciating piece. And where I was sort of joking, where my publisher was saying that the words, it's like somewhere between 35 and like 50,000 words, where 50,000 is good and 35 is really thin. And I was like, so here's the deal. Brevity is not like my strong suit. So what's the max where you just are going to shun me forever and I can't do it? So I came in pretty hot on words there. I was over by a few thousand, so we'll see.
Well, yeah. I was supposed to be 50 and I ended up being 60, and they were.
Yes. Okay, that's where. Yeah,
you might be okay.
I came in the first draft I sent was at 58,000 words, right about. So we'll see. And I don't know if that was like, is 50 a hard stop or just a suggestion? Because most people have a hard time writing a lot of words. So yeah, it's a interesting process, but I love this story. I have a lot of financial institution clients that I've worked with over the years and people I know that listen to the show. And every business, there's so many that you have a call center or you're on the phone with somebody. And for whatever reason, you feel that if they don't understand the importance of the circumstance, and if they don't know what could happen if they get it wrong, then they won't put the right effort in or something, but understanding for the motivation of the person on the other side, they want to not have to talk to you for a long time, right? Like they want to know the answer to your silly question and knowing, I know why you need me to give my unique passcode and why you can't have it should always be your mother's maiden name or whatever, because then if people know, they can find that data. Like, I get why you have the process, but it's frustrating. And the fear of I have no prompt for you. There's nothing I can do to help you. And it feels very flippant, I guess, of like, well, and when you get it wrong, because like everybody gets it wrong, like talk about priming people to mess up, right? And causing that stress, like you said, when they're already overwhelmed because they're buying a house. And then if you find out, well, like, and you know, it'll be a week before you can get that money and they're worried they're not going to get the house, then just all that stress. You can see how it snowballs when you aren't thinking about this, making it easy for them to do the thing that they need to do.
Yeah, all these behavioral biases around security and data, I think, are really interesting. And obviously, you know, that was, you know, again, something I wanted to write about in the book. And I spoke to some really fascinating experts around this, which is that those are problems that businesses are increasingly having to deal with. You know, more and more, obviously, businesses are having a digital focus, or at least having, you know, making their products and services available digitally. That privacy, data, security are all really important issues, but they're also very emotive issues as well. And people forget that, you know, that we look at the reactions to things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook, for example, you know, that had a very strong emotional reaction to that, and rightly so, you know, but it was, you know, those issues and the way that that we respond to them have a big behavioral element to them. It's not simply a case of you put in these security processes in place to protect people's privacy and that's the end of it. There is a balance to be struck between protecting people's privacy, understanding people's needs to have their data kept securely, and that's particularly important for banks because obviously there's a financial consequence of that. But also, you know, if a service isn't easy to use, if you're making your services less accessible, less cognitively easy for people in behavioral terms, then there's a big downside to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we said before we jumped on the phone, where I know that you and I could just sit and talk for days, really, but I want to be respectful of your time. So we'll go ahead and wrap up here with what is the best way for people to find you, and for everyone who I know is wanting to go pick up a copy of The Behavior Business with a U again when we've got the UK and, you know, Canadians on the show, Australians. But when anyone who's not in the US is on the show, assume there's a U in behavior. But what's the best way to get in contact with you, to get the book, learn more, all that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So the book is available from Amazon and most of, the online booksellers. I would talk about some of the real life bookstores, but most of those are closed, or at least not as accessible as they used to be, as well as direct from my publisher, which is Harriman House, they're called. And I also, there's a Twitter account associated with the book, which is just called, is just @Behavior Biz, B-I-Z, but also, and again, behavior with a U, but also there's a podcast accompanying it. So, as you mentioned, I interviewed 25 different experts for my book, and I recorded those interviews. So, if you're interested in hearing more on any of the people who are interviewed within the book, then you can hear that on the Behavior Business podcast. I'm also on Twitter @Rich_Chataway. So that's Chataway, Chataway. Also, obviously, I work for BVA Nudge Unit. We have a blog which has various articles and insights from people across our business. That's where you can hear more.
All the ways. Awesome. Well, there will be links to all of that great stuff in the show notes, so people can very quickly find you and the book and the podcast and all the Twitters and blogs of the world. There are links for you. So thank you again, Richard Chataway, for joining me today. It was fantastic to chat with you, as always.
And you. Thanks very much.
Thank you again to Richard Chataway, CEO of BVA Nudge Unit UK and author of The Behavior Business, for joining me on the show today. Isn't he so much fun? The first time I got to speak with Richard was when doing research for my own book, which comes out later this year. I'm so excited to share that there are 2 different stories from his work in the book. If you're not already on the list to be first to be notified when the book goes officially on pre-sale, please do sign up for that, which is in the show notes, along with a link to get your own copy of The Behavior Business. And for past episodes that we talked about today, including when I interviewed Nir Eyal, and a link to his book, Indistractable, which had that fascinating study about the flight attendants and their cravings, plus the episodes on priming, relativity, framing, social proof, time discounting, and more. there's a lot in there, which is why I put them in notes instead of expecting you to make notes yourself and try to remember everything. That's all waiting for you at thebrainybusiness.com/134. And if you know of someone who you think would benefit from this episode and the content within it, please take a moment to share it with them. You can send them that same link, thebrainybusiness.com/134, or share it directly from your app. While I interviewed Richard several months ago, I knew that the beginning of the year was the perfect time to have this interview go live. So many people are looking to change habits, quit difficult vices, or start new endeavors that could be hard for them. Insights from this interview and Richard's thoughtful approach could help someone keep their resolution and change their life for the better. So let's start 2021 off right and help people stick to those resolutions by spreading the insights of this episode. Thank you again to Richard Chataway, author of The Behavior Business, for joining me on the show today. It was a joy to chat with and learn from you. Next week, on episode 135, we're going to keep that pattern going, that theme of being able to change our behavior, when Aline Holsworth, principal at the Center for Advanced Hindsight and head of behavioral science at Pattern Health, will be joining me to talk about some of her insights and fascinating work that she's been doing over the years. It's going to be a lot of fun. You won't want to miss it. Until then, thanks again for listening and learning with me. And remember to be thoughtful.
Thank you for listening to the Brainy Business Podcast. Melina offers virtual strategy sessions, workshops, and other services to help businesses be more brain-friendly. For more free resources, visit thebrainybusiness.com.